The bracelet was engraved. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the party, not even the kiss I walked in on, but the fact that somebody had taken the time to have 4 letters etched into silver for my wife, and she'd hidden it well enough that I never once suspected it existed. My name is Greyson. I'm married to Vanessa. 11 years now, though as I write this, I'm not sure married is even the right tense anymore. For most of that decade, I would have told you our marriage wasn't just stable, it was the kind of stable other couples asked us for advice about. We had a house on Ashcombe Lane we'd renovated ourselves over the better part of 2 years, an easy rhythm to our weeks, the sort of trust that stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like weather. Just there, permanent, unquestioned. That Saturday, Vanessa had been unusually insistent about a party at her friend Paige's place. I wasn't in the mood. It had been a long week, and parties full of people I only half knew had never been my favorite way to spend a Saturday night. But she pushed harder than she normally would have, said it would mean a lot to her if I came, said Paige had specifically asked about me. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was sweet, that after 11 years, she still wanted me there, still cared whether I showed up. I didn't know it yet, but I would spend the rest of that night learning exactly why she'd needed me there so badly. We arrived around 8. Paige's house was full of the kind of low gold lighting that makes every party look like a magazine spread, string lights strung along the patio, a cluster of people I recognized from Vanessa's circle scattered across the backyard. I got a drink, made the kind of small talk you make at parties like these, and lost track of Vanessa somewhere between the kitchen and the pool house. Not unusual, not alarming, just the ordinary drift of 2 people at a party who don't need to hold hands the entire night to feel secure in each other. It was maybe 40 minutes later that I went looking for her, mostly because I was ready to head home and wanted to find out if she was too. I walked toward the pool house, where the noise from the main party had thinned into something quieter, more private, and that's when I saw her. Vanessa, standing close to a man I didn't recognize, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that wasn't casual, wasn't accidental, wasn't anything 2 acquaintances do at a party. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted toward him in a way I hadn't seen her look at anyone in years. Not even me. I stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, watching my wife lean into a stranger's hand the way she used to lean into mine. "Vanessa," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. She turned, and I watched the color drain out of her face in real time. Not the reaction of someone caught doing something innocent, but the reaction of someone whose worst-case scenario had just arrived 20 feet away from a backyard full of people she knew. "Greyson, this isn't," she started, and the man beside her took a half-step back, his expression shifting from mild alarm into something closer to resignation, like this was a scene he'd rehearsed for in his head and was now simply performing. "Who is this?" I said, though some part of me had already started putting the pieces together faster than I wanted to. "This is Brendan," Vanessa said, and the way she said his name, soft, familiar, a name she'd clearly said 100 times before in 100 different tones, told me more than any explanation she could have offered. I want to be honest that I don't remember every detail of what happened in the next few minutes with perfect clarity. I remember my hand closing around the front of Brendan's shirt, the low hum of party conversation around us dying out as people noticed, Paige's voice somewhere behind me saying my name like a warning. I remember someone's hands on my shoulders, pulling me back before I did something I couldn't undo. I remember Vanessa's face, streaked with mascara, saying my name over and over like it was the only word she had left. I didn't know it yet, standing in that backyard with half of Paige's guest list watching. But the scene in front of me was only the surface of something that had been going on for 4 months, hidden in places I hadn't thought to look. I left the party alone. Vanessa tried to follow me to the car, and I told her, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own, that I needed the night to think, and that I'd talk to her when I got home, if I got home at all that night. I ended up driving to my college friend's place instead, the one who'd gone on to become a lawyer, the one person I trusted enough to call at 11 at night with a sentence like, "I think my wife's been cheating on me, and I just found out at a party in front of 30 people. He didn't say much that first night, mostly just listened, got me a glass of water instead of the drink I probably wanted, and told me the same thing more than once. "Don't do anything tonight. Whatever you decide it tomorrow, with a clear head." I didn't sleep. I lay on his couch turning the last 4 months over in my mind, looking for the signs I must have missed, because surely, there had been signs. And once I started looking, they came fast, one after another, like a series of doors I'd walked past without opening. There was the night in early spring when Vanessa had started going to a new gym, one clear across town instead of the one 5 minutes from our house, and I'd thought nothing of it beyond mild curiosity about her sudden burst of motivation. There were the evenings she'd come home smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't wear, which I'd attributed, at the time, to crowded gym locker rooms and other people's showers. There was the way she'd started keeping her phone face down on the kitchen counter, a habit that had crept in so gradually I hadn't clocked it as a change until I was lying on my friend's couch, actively searching my memory for exactly this kind of detail. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever gone back through months of your own life after learning a single devastating fact, hunting for all the moments that fact should have announced itself and didn't, you know how strange that particular kind of hindsight feels. It isn't guilt exactly. It's closer to vertigo. The sense that the version of your life you thought you were living wasn't the one actually happening around you. Vanessa called 11 times that night. I didn't answer any of them. In the morning, there was a single text. "We need to talk. Please." I stared at that message for a long time before deciding I wasn't ready to give her the conversation yet. Not until I understood more of what I was actually walking into. I went home 2 days later, mostly because I needed clothes, and because avoiding the house on Ashcombe Lane wasn't going to make anything about this less true. Vanessa was there when I arrived, and the state of her, hollow-eyed, clearly having barely slept either, might have moved me, once, before the backyard, before Brendan's hand on her back. "Can we talk now?" she asked, standing in the kitchen doorway like she was afraid to come any closer. "I want to understand what I'm dealing with before I talk to you," I said. "I need to know how long. I need to know what's real and what isn't." She flinched at that, and something in her face told me she understood exactly why I'd want proof before I'd want her version of events. "For months," she said quietly. "It's been 4 months. I know that's not the answer you want." "For months," I repeated, letting the number settle. Longer than I'd initially assumed, standing in that backyard. Not long enough, apparently, for her to have found a way to end it on her own before I found it for her. I didn't say much else that day. I packed a bag, told her I needed more time, and left again, not because I didn't believe the number she'd given me, but because some part of me understood, even then, that a number offered under pressure in a kitchen doorway wasn't the whole truth. It was the smallest truth she thought she could get away with telling. I didn't know it yet, but the 4 months she'd admitted to were only the beginning of what I was about to find. I went back to my friend's place for most of the following week, and somewhere in the middle of it, the shock started giving way to something more methodical, a need to actually understand the shape of what had happened, rather than just its rough outline. My friend, with his lawyer's instincts, was the one who first suggested I look more carefully before any conversation about divorce or reconciliation went any further. "You need to know exactly what you're dealing with," he said, "not just what she's decided to tell you. People minimize. It's not always malicious. But you deserve the real picture before you make any decisions." I started with her social media, which felt almost too easy. Vanessa had never been especially careful about her privacy settings, and a handful of mutual friends had photos from events I hadn't attended, photos where Brendan appeared in the background more consistently than seemed accidental once I started actually counting. A work function from 2 months earlier. A birthday party I remembered her attending with the girls. A rooftop bar, the two of them seated close together at the edge of a larger group, his arm along the back of her chair in a posture I now recognized instantly. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever combed back through a life you thought you understood, watching a pattern emerge frame by frame in photographs other people posted without a second thought, you know how strange it feels to realize the story was visible the whole time, just never to you. Back at the house, while Vanessa was out, at Page's, she said, though I no longer took anything she told me about her whereabouts at face value. I looked through the parts of our home I'd never had reason to look through before. In the back of her closet, tucked into a shoebox I didn't recognize, I found a hotel key card from a place across town, dated weeks earlier. Beneath it, receipts, dinners, a bar tab, a florist charge that had never shown up on our joint account because, I realized, she'd paid for it in cash. And beneath all of that, at the bottom of the box, a small velvet pouch containing a silver bracelet, engraved with 4 letters I didn't recognize as any nickname of mine. A private joke, maybe, or an inside reference to something I had no part of. Next to it, folded into quarters, a handwritten note in unfamiliar handwriting. The kind of letter you write when you've stopped being careful about what you put on paper. I didn't read the whole thing. I read enough. This is what Vanessa told me, much later, about the night she bought that bracelet. A piece of the story I had no access to as it happened. I told myself buying it for him was different from anything I'd let myself do before, that it was just a way of thanking him for something that had started as innocent as 2 people talking too honestly at a work event. I remember standing in the store telling myself this wasn't a decision, it was just a gift, the way you tell yourself a lot of small things aren't decisions right up until they add up into something you can't undo. I thought about Greyson exactly once while I was picking it out, and I hated how easy it was to push the thought away and keep shopping. That's what she told me. At the time, I only knew that the box in my hands held more evidence of a relationship than 4 months could explain, that whatever this was, it had roots that went deeper than the number she'd given me in the kitchen. I called my friend that night and read him the receipts, the dates, the 4 letters on the bracelet. He was quiet for a moment before he said, "Greyson, I think you need to ask her again. Properly. Because I don't think 4 months is the real number." I didn't know it yet, but I was right to doubt it, and the real number, when it finally came, would be harder to hear than anything I'd found in that shoebox. I confronted Vanessa 2 nights later, the shoebox sitting between us on the kitchen table, its contents spread out in a way that made the whole thing feel less like a conversation and more like an exhibit. "We need to talk," I said, her phrase thrown back at her, though I don't think either of us noticed the irony until much later. She looked at the bracelet, the note, the receipts, and something in her face folded inward, the last of whatever composure she'd been holding onto since the party finally giving way. "It wasn't 4 months, she said quietly, before I'd even asked the question. I said 4 months because I thought that sounded survivable. "It's been closer to 7. 7 months. I repeated, and the number landed somewhere heavier than the first one had. Not because the difference itself was so large, but because it confirmed what my friend had already suspected, that she'd been managing the truth in careful installments, giving me only as much as she thought I could absorb at once. "I'm not trying to make excuses," she said, though everything about her tone suggested otherwise. I didn't know how to say the real number out loud. It felt like admitting something worse than the affair itself, somehow. Like the affair was a mistake, and the lying about how long was a choice. "They're both choices, Vanessa," I said. "Every single day you didn't tell me was a choice." She didn't argue with that. I'll give her that much. By this point, whatever instinct toward denial she'd had at the party seemed to have burned itself out, replaced by something closer to exhausted honesty, delivered without much fight left in it. "How did it start?" I asked, because I realized I needed to hear the shape of it, not just the evidence. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. "It started at a work thing, back in the spring. Brendan works with Paige's husband, and we ended up talking most of the night, and it felt— I don't know how to say this without it sounding like a justification, but it felt like being seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not because you'd stopped seeing me. I think I'd just stopped letting you. I'd gotten so used to going through the motions of us that having someone look at me like I was new again felt like air. The first time we kissed, I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time thing brought on by too much wine and not enough thinking. I believed that for maybe 2 weeks. Then he texted me, and I told myself answering once wasn't the same as continuing anything, and I kept telling myself some version of that lie every single time, for 7 months. Because the alternative was admitting I'd become someone who was capable of this. The bracelet. I bought that for him after we'd been seeing each other for about 4 months, right around the time I started telling myself, "And you." That 4 months was the whole truth. I think some part of me picked that number because it was the exact moment I'd started letting myself believe this had actually become something, instead of just a mistake I hadn't stopped making yet. I couldn't look at our wedding photos anymore, not for months. I started avoiding that hallway in our own house. That's when I think I really understood how far gone I already was, when I was rearranging my own home just to avoid the evidence of who I used to be with you. I sat there without saying much of anything, the weight of 7 months settling somewhere I couldn't fully process yet. "You asked me to come to that party," I said finally. "Why?" She closed her eyes. Because I think, somewhere underneath everything, I wanted it to end the way it ended. I don't think I could have stopped it on my own. I think some part of me needed you to see it, because I'd run out of the strength to tell you myself. I didn't know it yet, sitting at that table, but understanding the shape of her 7 months wasn't going to make the decision ahead of me any easier. It was just going to make it clearer. The weeks after that kitchen conversation were the strangest of my life. Vanessa's still in the house, still sleeping down the hall, both of us circling around a decision neither of us had fully made out loud yet. She apologized constantly, in every form she could think of, written notes left on my pillow, long messages sent while I was at work, a request, twice, that we see a therapist together before I made anything permanent. I agreed to one session, mostly because my friend suggested it might help me understand what I actually wanted, separate from the anger. The therapist was calm in a way that helped, a little. She had us each describe, without interrupting, what the year before the affair had actually felt like, not the version we told other people. Vanessa talked about feeling invisible in the routines of our marriage, about a kind of quiet neglect she hadn't found the words for until it was already too late to say them to me instead of to Brendan. I talked about how much of my trust in her had become a kind of laziness, assuming, rather than actively choosing, year after year, that everything between us was fine because I hadn't bothered to check. That was, I think, the most honest thing either of us said in that room. It didn't change my answer. I know I don't deserve a second chance, Vanessa said to me one evening, sitting across the kitchen table where all of this had first come apart. But I'm asking for one anyway, because I don't know how else to try to fix something I broke. I love you, Greyson. I know that's hard to believe right now, maybe impossible, but it's true, even with everything I did. I believe you loved me, I said. I don't think that's the question anymore. The question is whether I can spend the rest of my life wondering if a bracelet is going to turn up in a shoebox somewhere else. And I don't think I can. She cried, and I let her, without softening what I'd said. You deserve better than this, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. I know you're going to hear that from other people. I want you to hear it from me first, even though I'm the reason you need to hear it at all. Word had, predictably, spread through Paige's social circle within days of the party. The kind of story people can't help but talk about, especially once Brendan's reputation started unraveling alongside it. I heard, through my friend, that Vanessa hadn't been the only one, that at least one other woman in that same circle had a similar story about Brendan, one that surfaced only after mine did, as if my public confrontation had given someone else permission to finally say something out loud. Paige, to her credit, stopped inviting him to anything after that. Whatever charm he'd traded on for months seemed to lose its currency fast, once people started comparing notes. You need to talk to me eventually, Vanessa said, the final time she really pushed for reconciliation, maybe 3 weeks after the party. Not to fix it, just so this doesn't end with you hating me. I don't hate you, I said, and meant it even then. I just don't trust you, and I don't think either of us can build anything on what's left after that. She nodded, finally, like some part of her had known that was coming and had just needed to hear it said plainly before she could stop fighting it. I didn't know it yet, sitting across from her that evening, but that conversation would be the last time either of us seriously discussed staying together. Everything after it would be about how, not whether. We filed for divorce 6 weeks after the party. My friend handled most of it, which made an already difficult process at least procedurally simple. There were no children to divide custody of, no long argument over what belonged to whom. Mostly just the slow, administrative unwinding of 11 years into paperwork and signatures. We sold the house on Ashcombe Lane in the spring. I remember standing in the empty living room the day before closing, running my hand along a wall we'd painted together our first year in the house, and feeling less grief than I expected, more like closing a book I'd already finished reading, just tying up the physical loose ends of a story that had already ended somewhere else, weeks earlier, in a kitchen with a shoebox on the table. I kept seeing the therapist on my own after that first joint session, which turned out to be one of the better decisions I made in those months. She helped me untangle the parts of the story that were about Vanessa's choices from the parts that were about my own blind spots. The 11 years I'd spent assuming trust was something you built once and never had to actively maintain again. I don't think that assumption caused what happened. I do think it left me slower to notice it than I might otherwise have been. And that's a lesson I've carried forward, not as guilt, but as something closer to vigilance. Vanessa reached out once more, months later, not asking for reconciliation this time, just to tell me she was in her own therapy, trying to understand why she'd done what she did rather than simply regretting that she'd been caught. I told her I was glad she was doing the work, and meant it, and didn't offer anything beyond that. Some doors don't need to stay fully closed to also stay closed. I heard, secondhand, that Brendan's reputation never really recovered in that social circle, that the story of the party had followed him well past the initial gossip, that at least 2 of his own friendships quietly ended once people started asking questions about patterns rather than isolated incidents. I don't know if that's justice, exactly. It's just what happened, and I've stopped needing it to mean more than that. If there's a lesson in 11 years ending the way this one did, it isn't really about Vanessa or Brendan, or even the 7 months I didn't know about until a shoebox in a closet told me the truth in installments. It's about the difference between trust as a foundation you build once and trust as something you keep choosing, actively, on purpose, every single year you're given. I stopped choosing it somewhere along the way without realizing I'd stopped. I don't think that makes what happened my fault. I think it makes me someone who's learned, the hard way, what maintenance actually requires. I don't hate her most days. I loved her for 11 years, and I don't think loving someone that long disappears just because the story ended in a stranger's backyard instead of somewhere quieter. What I've learned to hold on to instead is simpler. I asked the questions, eventually, even after the worst of them had already been answered for me in public. I kept asking until I had the whole shape of it, not just the parts that were easiest to hear. And I'm still standing, in a smaller apartment, with a life that's slowly starting to feel like mine again instead of something I'm just recovering from. The most revealing detail in this story isn't the party itself, but the way Vanessa's confession arrived in careful installments. For months first, then 7. Each number offered only once the previous one had been proven insufficient, which shows a kind of self-protective honesty far more common than outright deception. People rarely lie once and completely, they lie in layers, giving up only as much truth as the pressure of the moment demands. The engraved bracelet functions as the story's clearest turning point, not because it proves the affair that was never in question after the party, but because it proves duration and intention, transforming what might have been dismissed as an impulsive mistake into something Vanessa had actively nurtured and financially invested in. Greyson's blind spot isn't naivety so much as a specific kind of complacency common to long marriages, mistaking the absence of active doubt for the presence of active trust, when the two are not the same thing at all. The social fallout for Brendan, the unraveling of his reputation, the other woman's story surfacing only after Greyson's went public, illustrates something true about how these situations often resolve outside the marriage itself. Exposure rarely stays contained to one relationship, and secrecy that worked for months collapses fast once a single person is brave enough to make it public. What the story ultimately traces is the gap between trust as a static inheritance from years already lived and trust as continuous labor, a gap Greyson didn't fully understand until he was standing in an empty living room, closing on a house that no longer held the marriage it had once been renovated to hold.